Hey everybody, my name is Luke from TheGospelHouse Ministries and welcome to Noble November. This is going to be hopefully an awesome series. We're going to be going through some stories in the Bible and we're going to be applying a lot of what we see with the characters in the story of the Bible, and we're going to see how to be noble. So my name is Luke from TheGospelHouse Ministries, and I love it if you could start turning to Daniel chapter 1, which if you need help, it's actually after Ezekiel. So go ahead and find Ezekiel, then after that book will be Daniel 1. And while you guys are flipping there, we're going to be seeing the definition of peer pressure. The definition of peer pressure is social pressure by members of one's peer group to take a certain action, adopt certain values, or otherwise conform in order to be accepted. Hear that? It says social pressure. So this is something that people around you are doing. So let's say you're friends, right? So this is going to be something very common because this is going to be associated with teenagers. Well, let's say you're walking through your school and you see one of your friends and they have their girlfriend. For all the ladies out there, you see your friend and they have a boyfriend, okay? And what is that going to do? That's going to pressure you. This is peer pressure. And you are hoping to, maybe I should do the same thing so I could be accepted with my peers. To take a certain action or in order to be conformed, in order to be accepted, to conform to the idea to be accepted. That is what peer pressure is by definition in the dictionary. But we're going to see in today's Bible story that peer pressure, guess what? Daniel himself went through peer pressure, but we're going to see the godly example instead of the worldly example that we see with peer pressure. So I love it right now, before we get into today's devotion, today's scripture, that we would ask God to reveal him and his word inside while we read and while we discover this. So let's go ahead and bow our heads. Father, Lord, thank you for those that are watching this that want to learn about how to be pure, how to be noble. And the one way we can do that is to learn about how to not really avoid peer pressure, but how to not be conformed into peer pressure, to be influenced by those around us so we can do the same thing. Help us to be a godly example. Please show us within your word of Daniel chapter 1 that speaks on how to, once again, not avoid peer pressure, but to control ourselves when peer pressure happens. In Jesus' name, amen. So, without further ado, let's jump into Daniel chapter 1. Daniel chapter 1 verses 1 through 3, you guys can read on your own, but it basically is about the reign of King Nebuchadnezzar. So the context of this is that Israel has been conforming to their idols, to idols that God said not to conform to. This is right after they've just entered the promised land. All of these great things that God showed them through Moses and through Joshua, but now they are starting to be conforming to the world instead of what God said. God said to not conform. Remember what Jesus said about salt? Salt is supposed to change the flavor. So why don't we be the salt of the world, changing the environment, changing the flavor? So we can use that example of Israel. They were supposed to, out of Egypt into the promised land, they were supposed to change the environment because people were already living there. But instead of changing, they were conforming. So God had to warn them that he was going to send judgment. He was going to send a punishment to them if they did not turn. He sent judges. He sent all of these prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, and they all said, God is going to put his judgment on you. They did not want to listen to them. They wanted to still conform to the idols into this world. So God had to punish them. So God allowed Babylon to come into Jerusalem, destroy their city, take everyone captive, including who we're going to see in verses 6 and 7 in Daniel chapter 1. But we're going to be seeing that Israel is now in Babylon. They are under the reign of King Nebuchadnezzar. That's what 1 through 3 says, that this is the reign of King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon, who is above, who is the ruler of Israel, that were supposed to change their culture, but instead they conformed. And this is their punishment for 70 years. But basically, the main point is this is the reign of King Nebuchadnezzar, and we're going to start in verse 4. Verse 4 says, "Youths without blemish, of good appearance, and skillful in all wisdom, endowed with knowledge, understanding, learning, and competent to stand in the king's palace and to teach them the literature and language of the Chaldeans." Everyone of Israel, they kind of push away Israel for a minute and they direct the spotlight on the youth, the younger generation that's going to outgrow their parents and their grandparents that are in here in Babylon. So we see number 1, youth occupation. So we see in verses 1 through 3, the reign of King Nebuchadnezzar. Now we see in verse 4, which I like to call youths educated, because this is about the younger generation being educated. As it says, look at this, they are endowed with knowledge, understanding, learning, and competent to stand in the king's palace and to teach them the literature and the language of the Chaldeans. They are being educated by the people of Babylon. Continuing in verse 5, it says, "The king assisted them a daily portion of food that the king ate." That's kind of sad because look, "and of the wine that he drank. They were to be educated for 3 years, and at the end of the time they were to stand before the king." So it says they were supposed to be educated for 3 years, basically from verse 4, saying that the children, the youth were being educated. And then it says in verse 5, they were there for 3 years being educated and standing in the king's palace. But it's kind of sad in verse 5, if you picked it up, it says that the king assisted a daily portion of food that the king ate and the wine that he drank. So basically the food that the king eats, the wine that the king eats, he is giving that portion to the youth, which is what I like to call youth defiled, which defiled basically means another word for spoiled. They are under authority of the king, but the king is giving them something that for Israel, that was unlawful. The food that they're eating, which we think that it's meat, that they said that was unlawful. So now we're going to see in verses 6 and 7, which number 2, we see the familiar quattro. Because in verses 6 and 7, it says this, verse 6, "Among these were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah of the tribe of Judah. And the chief of the eunuchs gave them names. Daniel he called Belteshazzar, Hananiah he called Shadrach, Mishael he called Meshach, Azariah he called Abednego." Those are familiar names. That's why I said that these were familiar names that we recognize. And here's a little fun fact. The reason why their names were changed is because their names were actually associated with the gods that Babylon worshipped. So basically what they were doing is that when the eunuchs, basically the servants of the king, were giving these names, they were basically saying that you are no longer in the one true God's land. You are in our land now. So these names are to forget the promised land that God had. These are the names that are for our gods. And obviously we see throughout the book of Daniel that they never conform with what their names actually say. They are very faithful to God within Babylon, which is why he blesses them. So this is the familiar quattro, because we know Daniel, we know Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, the fiery furnace. So then we're going to continue in verse 8, which now we see number 3, not defiled. Look at this in verses 8. Look at this in verse 8. "But Daniel resolved that he would not defile himself with the king's food or with the wine that he drank. Therefore, he asked the chief of the eunuchs to allow him not to defile himself." It says that, remember when we talked about the king, whatever the king ate, which supposing it was meat and it's wine, which is not really great for youth's health, Daniel says, he says to the eunuchs, he says to them, he says, no. We do not want to eat the king's food. We do not want to spoil ourselves. That was the wisdom that God gave Daniel and his friends. I believe his friends agreed to this as well. It never says that. We can see that they agreed because Daniel associated his friends later in the chapter. So Daniel was not going to, once again, spoil himself with the king's food. Think about this. All the other king's kids are eating the king's food that is very unhealthy for them because they're just in their youth. And Daniel says no. Just because everyone else is eating, just because everyone else is drinking, does not mean that we have to. And now we see in verses 9 through 16, we see number 4, the test. Look at this in verse 9. And God gave Daniel favor and compassion in the sight of the chief of the eunuchs. And the chief of the eunuchs said to Daniel, I fear my lord the king, who assisted your food and your drink. For why should he see that you were in worse condition than the youths who you were of your own age? So would you endanger my head with the king? Then Daniel said to the steward of whom the chief of the eunuchs had assigned over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, test your servants for 10 days. Let us be given vegetables to eat and water to drink. Then let our appearance and the appearance of the youths who eat the king's food be observed by you, and deal with your servants according to what you see. So he listened to them in this matter and tested them for 10 days. At the end of the 10 days, it was seen that they were in better appearance and fatter in flesh than all the youths who ate the king's food. So the steward took away their food and the wine they were to drink and gave them vegetables. Wow. So we see in verse 9, we see favor in Daniel. It says that God gave Daniel favor in the eyes of the chief of the eunuchs who were assigning the food from the king. The king was assigning this food to all the youth, and Daniel says no, but it says that they had compassion on him. I call it the compassionate argument. Basically, after verse 9 and verse 10, he kind of argues with him, not because for just negative purposes, but a compassionate purpose. He sees something different in Daniel, but he's worried about what he's going to go through and what himself is going to go through. He basically says, are you going to endanger my head? Are you going to make the king kill me because I am doing something that he is not assigning? And then we see in verses 11 through 13, we see Daniel's healthy request. Daniel requests not meat, not wine, but vegetables and water, as it says in verse 12. It says, test your servants for 10 days. Let us be given vegetables to eat and water to drink. He's basically saying, I'm not going to defile myself, as it says back in verse 8, but he is going to pursue vegetables and water. And while every other kid is eating meat and drinking wine, him and his friends, he says, not just me, but let us be tested for 10 days, which that is the genesis of the challenge, as we see in verse 14, that the eunuchs say, okay, so the king agrees to this. So he tests Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Daniel and his 3 friends, they test them. And it says in verse 15 that they were better in appearance and fatter in flesh than everyone else, than all the youths who ate the king's food and drank the wine. That is saying something. But then this is really cool. We see back in verse 15 and 16 that we see Daniel's decision influence. We see the influence of it. You see, they were tested. Daniel and his friends were tested to see if they were any better. And it says they were better in appearance. So guess what? The eunuchs then assign that all the other youths that are eating meat and drinking wine, that is to be taken away, and they are to eat what Daniel and his friends requested to eat instead. That is some blessing. And speaking of blessing, then we see in verses 17 through 21, we see blessed results. Verse 17, as for these 4 youths, God gave them learning and skill in all literature and wisdom, and Daniel had understanding in all visions and dreams. At the end of the time, when the king had commanded that they should be brought in, the chief of the eunuchs brought them in before King Nebuchadnezzar, and the king spoke with them. And among all of them, none was found like Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Therefore they stood before the king. And in every matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king inquired of them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians, than all the enchanters that were in his kingdom. And Daniel was there until the first year of King Cyrus. Wow. Hear that in verse 20. That is amazing. We see in verse 17 that God gives them wisdom. God-given wisdom. We see that God gives them wisdom. He gives them understanding. He definitely did. God gave Daniel and his 3 friends that he gave them wisdom. He gave them understanding that, hey, we're not going to be eating the king's food once again, because that's a key factor in this story. Daniel and his friends saying, we're not going to eat the king's food. We're going to eat vegetables instead because we want to not defile ourselves. And then they are blessed because of it, and they're given wisdom. God gives them wisdom. And it says that Daniel received visions and dreams. And that's going to appear. If you read throughout the whole book of Daniel, it's all about prophecy. It's really cool. I encourage you to read the entire book of Daniel as like a devotion, as a study. It's a really cool book. I've read the entire thing before. It's amazing. So Daniel was given visions and dreams, understanding in all visions and dreams. And then we see in verses 18 through 20, we see the king appreciated them. We totally saw that in verse 20. That was so cool. It says that the king in verse 19, he said, none was found like Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Daniel, his 3 friends, the king's saying there's no one better than these guys. And we see that clearly in verse 20, where it says that he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and all the enchanters that were in his kingdom. That is something to be excited about. And we see that Daniel remained there before the king in verse 21, as it says he's going to be there for the first year of King Cyrus. That's some blessing. That I just can't wrap my head around that. The king says that they are found 10 times better, all because of choosing not to follow the crowd. They are blessed because they did not defile themselves with the king's food. Wow. That is amazing. Daniel and his friends were above and beyond blessed because they did not follow the crowd of eating the king's lawful food. That is the whole thing, guys. Daniel and his friends did not defile themselves. I say that over and over and over again because it's a key factor in this whole story. That talked about peer pressure, where while it says everyone else, every youth was eating and drinking the king's food, Daniel and his friends said, no, we're not going to follow the crowd. We're going to eat what God has instructed us, that we should be healthy with our bodies. Now, they didn't have the New Testament, but it reminds me back in the New Testament when Paul says, I think it's 2 Corinthians 6, they says that this is our body. This is given to us by God. This is not of our own. We are to glorify God with our body. So not just with praise and worship, we are to glorify God with our bodies by eating healthy food, keeping our body fit, and doing everything that keeps this healthy. This as a temple of the living God, where the Spirit dwells. We are to be healthy in the Spirit and also to be healthy physical. So as we end off this first episode of Noble November, here is the key takeaway. Peer pressure will often come, but you always have the choice to follow the crowd or stand out for Christ. Let me say that again. Peer pressure will often come, but you always have the choice to follow the crowd or to follow Christ and to stand out against everyone. Hey, from this story, what can you take away? You see, Daniel and his friends did not conform to what everyone else was doing. And because of that, they were blessed. They got to stand before the king, and the king saw them better than anyone else in his kingdom. If you're peer pressured today, if there's peer pressure around you, you're feeling that social pressure that you need to impress people in order to be conformed, you're gonna lose friends. I'm just gonna say that. You're gonna lose friends if you do that. As everyone else has a boyfriend or girlfriend, you stand out of the crowd and you say, no, I'm not gonna defile myself. I want to be pure. I want to be noble for Christ. And they're gonna look at you, they're gonna scoff at you, they're gonna wonder what's wrong with you, but don't be impressed about their reaction. Think about how God feels about you. And if you are in a relationship right now, I can't help you in any way because I'm not. But what I can influence you is, just like Daniel and his friends did not follow the crowd of peer pressure, God could bless you for not following the crowd. For example, maybe while you're worshiping, raise your hands and praise the God who lives instead of looking around to see who is going to look at you when you do it. Don't be peer pressured. I do that every single time now. I don't care who's looking at me. I close my eyes, I lift my hands as high as I can, and I try to get those vocals in, but it's not about how good of an appearance you are. It's about who do you follow. Do you follow the crowd or are you following Christ? My name is Luke from TheGospelHouse Ministries, and this is Noble November, episode 1. And I'll see you next week for we're going to be talking about pride.